Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. I'm Cali Black, and I'm here with the story version of what's going on in the scriptures this week so that you can focus on the application and listening to those spiritual promptings instead of having to worry so much about the comprehension side of it. This week we are studying Ezra chapters 1 and 3 through 7, and then Nehemiah chapters 2, 4 through 6, and 8. These are not the most well-known books in the Old Testament, but they do tell us some really important stories that I'm excited to jump into this week because we are at the end of the story of the Old Testament this week. Next week we have a story that happens pretty much at the same time, but this is it. Like this week and next week happen at the same time. We are at the end of the historical story. Everything else we'll study after this point will be able to fit in. So if your brain has been able to keep up with where we're at, or you've at least gotten pieces here and there, this is it. You've made it. Congratulations. Last week we talked about the scattering of Israel. Last week's video was super important to understand in order to make this week's make sense. So please make sure you watch the one for 2 Kings 17 through 25, because that is going to set the scene perfectly in case you don't understand what's going on. But as a super quick recap, Israel has been scattered, which means the northern kingdom, remember, they were captured by the Assyrians. They were taken away. Their capital city of Samaria had kind of a whole mishmash of people that were sent there. So now it's this group of people in the Samaritans living in Samaria who are worshiping God, and they think they're doing it right, but they're also worshiping a whole bunch of other people and different gods and different traditions at the same time. They're not doing it right, but they think they are. It's this really unique group, the Samaritans in Israel. But the rest of the tribes of Israel, the other 10 tribes of the north, we've considered them scattered at this point. They've been taken away into Assyria, and we don't have written record of what happened to them afterwards. Okay, then we have the southern kingdom of Judah. They were captured by the Babylonians and taken into Babylon, right? And the city of Jerusalem was effectively destroyed. They destroyed the temple. They tore down the walls. They decimated this huge, important city. The Babylonians completely destroyed it, and they carried all of the Judahites or Jews into Babylon with them, which was to the east of where Judah was. So that's where we're at. We have the Jews living in Babylon. We call it living in captivity. Okay. So they're living there amongst the Babylonians, but they're not allowed to go back to their home. Now, something we have to cover is that after this happens, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. So the Persians live even further east than the Babylonians. And they came and they conquered the Babylonians. The Persians were on a huge spree, by the way. Their territory at this point in time covered the entire area over there. The Persians were a huge nation. So they came and they conquered the Babylonians. So now we still have, if you think physically, the Jews are still living in the same place, but now it's considered Persia. Okay? They haven't moved at all. They're still in captivity where Babylon used to be, but now they're considered Persians under Persian rule. Okay? So you're just going to see this switch here as we study Ezra and Nehemiah talking about Persian kings and living in the Persian land. That's why. The Jews haven't moved. They're still in Babylon, but it's the Persian rule. Okay? So, chapter 1, we learn about the king of Persia named King Cyrus. He's a good guy. We like King Cyrus. And King Cyrus receives a proclamation. Now, let's talk about timeline-wise. There has been about 40 years between when Jerusalem fell and Babylon captured them and took them away, and this moment right here with King Cyrus, okay, about 40 years. So if you think about the Jews living in captivity there in Persia, a lot has happened in 40 years. People have died, and a new generation, at least, maybe even 2 generations, has been born in captivity in Persia / Babylon. So we have this kind of interesting mix. There's now a bunch of Jews who have never even lived in Jerusalem or the land of Judah. They've been born in captivity in that land there. Okay, so 40 years have passed. We have King Cyrus, he's the Persian king, and he sends out a proclamation to the land saying, hey, I would like to send a whole bunch of Jews back to Jerusalem to go and rebuild their temple. Now, this actually was a common political strategy at the time, is when you conquered a new land, you would send some smaller groups to go back and like rebuild their homeland, and it built up really good goodwill towards the people who had conquered them, and they weren't as likely to rebel because they were able to go back and rebuild their land anyways, and it was this goodwill. But King Cyrus also mentions that he was told by the Lord to do this, and so I'm sure it was likely a combination of both of these things here. But King Cyrus says, I'm going to have some Jews go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temples. So about 50,000 Jews make this journey. And all in all, there were at least 1 million Jews, likely millions of Jews. So 50,000 of them is not a huge percentage. So not everyone's making this journey at all, but everyone else is supporting them and giving them money and giving them things to, like, supplies to help build the temple. Like, everyone's wishing them really well, and they make the journey. The journey is about 1 to 2 months on foot. So if you're making this journey, you're probably staying in Jerusalem for a long time. Most people assume it's going to be for the rest of their lives that they're making this journey, and they make that journey over to Jerusalem. Number 2, there is a guy named Sheshbazzar that we learn about in chapter 1. He says he's a prince of Judah, and the king gives him items that were taken from the temple originally, and he makes the journey. We skip chapter 2, which just kind of tells us who made that actual journey to Jerusalem. Chapter 3, we are now in Jerusalem. Woohoo! 40 years after it was conquered for the final time by the Babylonians. And we learn about 2 important people that you're going to want to know about. First is Zerubbabel. He's kind of appointed as the political leader of Jerusalem with this group that's going. And secondly, Jeshua, who kind of is the religious leader. But the 2 of them seem to work together often. So Zerubbabel and Jeshua, you're going to see them making decisions with this new group of Jews entering the town of Jerusalem. They rebuild the altar. They rebuild the foundation of the temple where the original foundation was. And it's just this happy, joyous occasion. And there were even some people who made that journey back who were alive to remember the original temple in Jerusalem, and they wept with joy. I can't even imagine the emotions that they felt seeing the temple start to be rebuilt that they remembered from 40 years beforehand, and probably even earlier than that. So pretty cool. We're starting this process. Now, here's a problem. Chapter 4. The Samaritans hear what's happening. Samaritans live north of Jerusalem. And they're like, hey, our friends, the Jews, are coming back. We love to worship God. They're rebuilding the temple. This is awesome. Let's go help them. So they come down to offer their help, and the Jews in Jerusalem refuse their help. They say, you're not worshiping God correctly. The Samaritans were not worshiping God correctly. And they say, we don't want your help then. Well, the Samaritans from this point forward make life extremely difficult for the Jews. You're going to read about a lot of different things that the Samaritans try and do to stop the Jews from rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. So this is really where the root of some of the worst animosity comes from, are a lot of these conflicts here. In fact, they even write a letter to the Persian king saying, you let Jews back into Jerusalem, you should look into the history of Jerusalem, because they're kind of a rebellious people against people who try and conquer them. The Persians didn't know who the Jews were. The Persians were way far away. I mean, vaguely they did, but they had no interaction with the Jews, because Babylon was far enough away and Persia was even further. So they're kind of like, hey, read your history books, and the Jews in Jerusalem should not be trusted. Chapter 5, we have 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. This is when they live. We'll learn more of their their writings later. But this is when they live, and they tell Zerubbabel and Joshua, keep building the temple. I know there's opposition, but keep building the temple. Keep building the temple. That is your focus. There's even another group of people who write a letter to the king of the Persians saying, you've got to stop the Jews at Jerusalem. Like, literally everything is against these Jews trying to build the temple. But then you've got the prophets on the inside like, do it, keep going, encouraging them. And in chapter 6, King Darius is now the new king of Persia. So King Darius, he gives an official proclamation saying, let the Jews build the temple. And in fact, donate to their cause. So he really stands up for these Jews in Jerusalem after so much opposition and so many people trying to appeal to him. He uses his power to stand up for the Jews and to let them build that temple. They build the temple, and in the end of chapter 6, they are able to rededicate the temple. Like, this is it. They rebuild it, they rededicate it. There is now a temple in Jerusalem. Yay! Okay, now our next chapter is the very next chapter, chapter 7 in Ezra, right? Like, you wouldn't think that there's a big time jump, but between chapters 6 and chapter 7, we are skipping 67 years. In fact, that's a great way to remember it. Between 6 and 7, 67 years pass. It doesn't say that in the Bible, so you need to know that, because we're now going to meet Ezra. You may have been wondering, why is this book called Ezra and who is Ezra? Now we're going to find out. So Ezra is a Levite priest who lives among the Jews, right? Because Levite priests kind of lived among all of the other tribes. They didn't have their own area. So he's a Levite priest living in captivity in Persia / Babylon. We'll call it Persia right now. And he was born in captivity. So he's never been to Jerusalem, even though his ancestry is from that area. He is living in captivity. And he is a scribe for the king, the Persian king. He's a scribe. And he starts by writing down what happened 67 years earlier when the first group of Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Okay, so everything that we just read, Ezra is actually writing as like a history lesson from 67 years previously. Hopefully this is making sense here. But in chapter 7, we now jump to the present in Ezra's time as Ezra is writing this down. He also then goes to the king and he says, I want to take another group back to Jerusalem. It's been 67 years now. That's a long time. I want to go and fix up the temple because the temple needs repairs at this point. And the Persian king is like, absolutely, take a big group. You go back to Jerusalem and here's some more supplies. Like, let's make it easy for you. And so that's what we end chapter 7 with. There's a group and Ezra is leading them, a pretty big group, it seems like, of Jews that are now leaving Persia and going to Jerusalem to fix up the temple, because now it's been 67 years since it was then rebuilt at that point. Okay, now we jump to Nehemiah chapter 2. Now, Nehemiah was a cup holder for the king. Now we know that this is the same king that Ezra worked for. Okay, so Ezra was a scribe for a king in Persia. Nehemiah was the cup holder. It's kind of like the butler. It's a very important role for the king. Now, Nehemiah is a Jew, and he was also born in captivity. He had never been to Jerusalem in his life. But the king talks to him one day and is like, I can tell that something's weighing on your mind. And Nehemiah admits that he's been having these thoughts and these dreams and just these impressions that he needs to go back to Jerusalem in order to help fix it and fortify it. And Nehemiah is like, okay, the king to Nehemiah is like, okay, go ahead, you can go. Nehemiah, it seems like he takes just a small group of Jews. He doesn't take a large group with him. It's just kind of like a small group that's gathered and traveling together, and they head over to Jerusalem. All right. Chapter 3, it just talks about how they are gathering supplies there in Jerusalem. And in chapter 4, now that Nehemiah has arrived, we see some opposition from the Samaritans and some other people in the land, like the Ammonites and other people who are like, what is this guy doing with this new group that just arrived from Jerusalem? Because Nehemiah's plan is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Rebuilding the walls kind of has a connotation that you're protecting something. And so that kind of rubbed everyone else the wrong way, especially the Samaritans. They're like, we don't want you rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, because we kind of know what that implies. And so the Samaritans make life really, really hard for the Jews, and Nehemiah in his efforts to rebuild the walls. They're trying to cut off their supplies. You'll read lots of different interactions that they have, but it's not a good time. But Nehemiah is like, he's a powerhouse leader. He arms his men so that they can defend themselves. He's praying for help from God to help keep them protected as they're doing these efforts to try and rebuild Jerusalem's walls that have started to crumble. And in chapter 5, Nehemiah learns that there's Jews in Jerusalem who have started to like enslave each other because you owe me this and you didn't pay this debt. And Nehemiah is like, cut it out, especially to these wealthy lords. Stop enslaving everyone and give everyone back their own lands. So you're going to read about that for just a little bit. And then in chapter 6, this is a pretty famous interaction, although you may not have realized this is what's happening. But the Samaritan governor named Sanballat, he implores Nehemiah to come out and meet with him, to stop doing his work on all these walls and to come out and meet with him. And Nehemiah refuses 5 times because he is doing a great work and will not come down from what he's doing. So really cool example. Nehemiah is insistent and dedicated to his work of rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem. Sanballat, the Samaritan governor, is not happy. He tries to blackmail Nehemiah. He does everything. Like, there is so much opposition against the good that these Jews are trying to do within Jerusalem, but they finish the wall. And in fact, they've built the wall in 52 days. 52 days, which is just insane. It really shows that the Lord was helping them with so much opposition. They were also able to work so quickly and fortify and rebuild those walls in 52 days, which is unheard of. Let's be real, even in modern times. But especially at that point. And then last chapter that we study is chapter 8. And this is where the worlds kind of collide, right? It's Nehemiah chapter 8, but we read about Ezra. Remember, Ezra is the other book that we had read, and he had come over with a bigger group. We read that Ezra found the book of the law, which are the commandments, which are, the law of Moses, and he's reading it out loud to all the people there in Jerusalem. They're translating it to make sure that everyone can understand what's going on, and everyone is so happy. They end up celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacles for the first time properly since Joshua's time, almost 1,000 years earlier. So really, they're instituting the law. And I just want to add this small commentary because it was so fascinating to me as I did research about these chapters for my study guide, that when we think about the Jews in Christ's time, we think about them being super strict and wanting to stick to the law of Moses for the most part. I'm overgeneralizing, and there's certain portions and subdivisions that were more strict than others, but overgeneralizing, a lot of them really, we think of them as sticking to the letter of the law, right? Like, really, you'll be saved by just following the law. But as we read the Old Testament, we're like, the children of Israel forgot about the law all the time. They literally kept losing the law and refinding it and then losing it and oh yeah, we're supposed to do that feast and that Passover and that we're supposed to worship this way. It doesn't seem to connect, but most scriptural historians point to this time period, the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, when they're back in Jerusalem after there was an initial group that came back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, but then it's the second wave of Nehemiah and Ezra's time. This is when that shift starts to happen, where they get so engrossed in, we've got to follow the letter of the law. We've got to celebrate everything exactly as it's laid out. Of course, There are great things about this, and of course, I'm sure you can imagine there are pitfalls to it, and we see that in the New Testament, of course. But kind of for the Old Testament, it's like, yes, they're finally getting back to the law. That's what they should be doing this whole time. In the New Testament, we see how some of them took that way too far, instead of focusing on their heart. But just interesting commentary that, like, this is the transition here at Ezra and Nehemiah's time to, like, what do the scriptures say? Let's do exactly that, and then we'll be good. All right, that is it. That is the end of the Old Testament, like, story-wise. Next week, as I said, the story of Esther happens at the same time, but it's back in Persia. So we are done with Jerusalem and our story here, as the Jews start to rebuild and are welcome to go back to their land. I think my personal focus question, I love Nehemiah. He's the second guy we talked about, remember? He had never been to Jerusalem, right? He just had these impressions and these thoughts and these dreams that were like, I need to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And that was just his thing. And I feel like on a personal note and currently, we all can't care about the same issues equally. Like, that would just blow all of our minds if we all cared about the same things for the same amount. And so I believe that God gives us gifts of caring or thinking about certain things more than others. So you may have noticed, like, and that's kind of what I want to reflect on this week. What things do I care about? And it seems like I care about them more than others. How can that then be like my superpower? How can that be my strength? Me fulfilling my purpose and everyone else fulfilling their purposes and focusing on what they're focused on and what comes to their mind and their impressions and their dreams. And if we're all doing our part, we're going to make great things happen. Nehemiah, he knew his job was to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but other people knew that their jobs were something totally different, and that's why it all worked together. So I want to really turn inwards, especially access that personal revelation. What's my purpose? What am I supposed to do? What's weighing on my mind? And how is that a sign, possibly from God, that that's what my focus should be, while everyone else does their own little thing as well? Okay, have a great week this week studying the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Don't let all these details drag you down. There are so many great examples. Just know that there was a lot of opposition, but they were able to rebuild Jerusalem. And man, you can find spiritual parallels there too. All right, have a great week and happy studying.